Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of Carl Gallups' book, The Magic Man in the Sky, from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 10, 11, and 12 of the book. So let's get started with chapter 10, which is titled The Tale of Two Dimensions. In this chapter, Gallups offers a further illustration, actually several further illustrations, of the concept explored in the previous chapter of God's world and our world that we experience every day being equally real but separate dimensions of reality. It is, or is it possible rather, he asks, for one reality to be surrounded by another equally real reality and yet be totally unaware of it, as it is said that our reality is sort of surrounded and sustained by God's reality? Well, of course, Gallups' answer is yes, that is possible. He uses the example of a pond. Beneath the surface of the pond is an entire ecosystem that is populated by organisms which are totally unaware of the world beyond. The pond would be one level of reality, and the world beyond the pond would be another equally real level of reality. And the organisms that live in the pond would not know anything about the world above the pond, or at least that would be the case if they were capable of the sort of awareness that Gallups attributes to them in the analogy. But that lack of awareness that they have doesn't mean that the world beyond the pond isn't real and doesn't exist and doesn't have the ability to affect the world of the pond for good and for bad. Gallups describes how a resident of this pond called Mr. Fish might perceive reality. Quote, "He cannot fathom mathematics, scientific exploration and cultivation of food sources, factories or communication technologies. A computer or a library or a book would be meaningless to Mr. Fish. In fact, he cannot fathom that you are reading about his existence at this moment. He is convinced that the sum total of reality exists below the surface of the pond. It is his entire world, his universe. However, he is entirely wrong in his limited assessment of what is real and what is not." Well, I have two main problems with Gallups' pond metaphor. The first is with the metaphor itself, and the second is with how Gallups is using the metaphor. First, the fish in Gallups' pond is incapable of understanding or even conceiving of a world outside his pond. And Gallups describes the fish in this way when he initially presents the analogy. I'm not just talking about real fish. The fish described by Gallups are described as being unable to fathom books and libraries and communications, and they can't even conceive that we are here reading about them at this moment. These are fish that are incapable of perceiving a world or imagining a world beyond the pond. Now, Gallups will alter his metaphor in a little bit. We'll make it so that the fish are capable of imagining such things. But for right now, they're just fish. They can't even think of anything beyond the pond. And fish are actually quite remarkable creatures, but in real life they are exactly as Carl Gallups describes them initially in his metaphor. They are unable to perceive and comprehend reality like we do, at least as far as we know. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't communicate the existence of the world beyond the pond to them in any meaningful way because they just aren't capable of receiving that kind of information. Ourselves and the fish are separated by a gap that can never be bridged. But that is not the situation in which we humans find ourselves, at least not according, again, to Carl Gallups and the way he describes our predicament. If it were, as things are described as being in the pond, then it would be just as impossible for God to communicate with us as it is for us to communicate to the fish in the pond. For while Gallups would be quick to argue that we humans lack the ability to perceive and understand God and his dimension fully, his entire position rests on the assumption that we are able to perceive and understand it to a certain degree. If we couldn't, if we were truly like the fish, then the existence or non-existence of God would be an irrelevant question to us, an unfalsifiable premise. Because even if God was there would be no way for him to ever make us aware of his existence. But Gallups, among others, claims that God can make us aware of his existence and that God, in fact, has done that very thing. He's not saying that God's world is totally invisible and unknown to us. He's saying that it is typically invisible to us. It's not something we can see when we look around, like we can see the world in our immediate environment. But he is saying that God has revealed himself and revealed his world to us. And that makes both that revelation and the claims related to that revelation fair game for skeptical investigation. Gallups cannot hide behind the invisibility and the incomprehensibility of God, because if God were truly invisible and incomprehensible, no one would know anything about him. But Gallups claims to know at least a few things about him, which makes God at least partially visible and comprehensible, unlike the world beyond the pond is to the fish. Now, the second problem I have with the fish metaphor is the same problem I have with very much of the rest of what Gallups has presented in the book thus far. The pond metaphor is just an elaboration of Gallups's previously stated position. It draws an adequate picture explaining how Gallups sees the relationship between our world and God's world, but it offers no evidence compelling us to accept that this picture reflects reality. Gallups compares a fish whom he names Mr. Dolphins in a rare moment of something approaching within a few thousand miles of cleverness. It's not clever, it's as close as Gallups gets. Mr. Dolphins. And Mr. Dolphins denies the existence of the world beyond the pond. This is what I mean when I say he alters his metaphor. The fish go from being completely incapable of even conceiving of a world outside the pond to acknowledging that there are some who do conceive of a world outside the pond, but rejecting those conceptions. Anyway, he compares Mr. Fish, Mr. Dolphins, to an atheist in our world who denies the existence of the supernatural. The fish insists that there is no evidence of a world beyond the pond, a world above, and those who have been to this supposed upper world from the pond return either reporting nothing but blurriness or they don't return at all. Therefore, the reports of the world above the pond are deemed to be not credible and not to be believed, just as we skeptical atheists dismiss all the accounts and claims and stories about the supernatural. A fish denying the existence of a world above the water is meant to sound ridiculous, and it does, because we know that a world beyond the pond does exist. We know going in that the fish is wrong and that the fish's beliefs are ignorant and absurd. We have no such certainty that the world Gallups proposes exists above our own world in God's dimension actually exists. We have the claims that Gallups makes about that dimension and how Gallups says he came to know the things that he claims to know, the Bible, the revelation of the Holy Spirit, that sort of thing. So again, it all comes back to those things, to the evidence, to how Gallups got to where he is in his position. Gallups labors so tirelessly to make sure that we understand the concept he's describing, because he has precious little to offer by way of demonstrating that this concept is anything other than imaginary. And once again, Gallups brings up quantum physics for, I believe, the third consecutive chapter, and the strange, unseen, but totally real world of quantum particles. Again, trying to draw a comparison, a parallel between the quantum world and God's world. And once again, he totally misses the point. Quantum mechanics describes real things, things which are demonstrable, testable, predictable. Yes, it's true that under ordinary circumstances, the things quantum mechanics describes are invisible to us. But that doesn't mean that any other proposed world said to be unseen but real is therefore plausible. You need evidence that what you are proposing is true. You can't use the existence of one totally unrelated thing as evidence for the existence of some other thing. Gallups continues hammering home his two dimensions concept with a pair of additional examples, because the fish in the pond wasn't enough. He also tells us about an anthill and the microbial world. He writes that he is certain that God has provided these examples so that we would be without excuse. Hypothetical examples prove nothing. If God cares about convincing us, instead of inspiring Gallups to create more analogies, how about some evidence? Anyway, so the anthill. The ants, like the fish in the pond, are completely unaware of the world beyond their colony, and yet that world beyond exists. Now Gallups throws in a little bit of a twist. He says, suppose that an ant from this anthill could, upon its death, be transformed from an ant into a human, capable of perceiving and understanding that larger world beyond the anthill. The ant, once it is a human, would realize that the universe was far grander than it had ever imagined, and that the pile of dirt it once thought of as the world was but a shadow of the reality that had existed all around it all along. Quote, does this scenario sound familiar at all? Does this not sound like the memorable passages of Scripture describing the entry into our new life upon exiting this world? Does the Bible not speak of a new existence, a new life that does not end, without death, without pain? Does it not speak of the old things passing away and the new things now being among us? In fact, the Bible declares all of these things. So? I mean, really, I'm not trying to be a smartass. I mean, I kind of am, but it's not the main point. I'm asking, what is this supposed to prove? So the Bible and the analogy that the guy who believes in the Bible made up to describe what the Bible says agree with each other. What is that supposed to prove? Gallups has crafted a series of analogies that illustrate what he, as a Christian, believes about God and the nature of life, death, and reality. Fine. How many more times is he going to present the same case in a slightly different way before he finally gets around to proving that case? Because, as I said, most of us who reject that belief, who deny the existence of that God, or at least withhold belief in the existence of that God, do so based on the lack of evidence, not because we believe that such a thing in principle is completely logically impossible. The fact that you can tell the same story 1,000 different ways doesn't make it true. Each telling is not evidence of anything other than your own imagination, or in this case, I suspect your own capacity for distraction. Following the anthill analogy is the microbe analogy, but I'm going to skip that because it's just like the fish story and the anthill story, only with microbes. Gallups ends the chapter with this, quote, may we be overwhelmed at what we see and understand through real science and the truth that is revealed to us by God's Holy Spirit and through His Word. May we never again claim to be wise until we are first willing to become foolish in the eyes of the world. Well, you got that one covered, Carl. Moving on to chapter 11, which is titled Atheism and Agnosticism, a Pondering. Gallups begins his ponderings about atheism and agnosticism like this, quote, as we think about those in the fish pond with us, in particular, who refuse to consider even the remotest possibility of the supernatural realm, let us take a moment to define some terms, namely atheism and agnosticism. Thank you, Carl, for reminding me that I should be careful about accepting your definitions of terms, since you can't even get to that point without strawmanning the position of many of those atheists and agnostics who you are attempting to describe. I can't speak for every atheist, but I can speak for myself, and I've gotten the impression that my position on this matter isn't that far out of line with most of my fellow atheists. My issue isn't that I refuse to consider the remotest possibility of there being a supernatural realm. Now, that is obviously the premise on which you have based your very strenuous and repetitive arguments, but that's not where I'm coming from. My issue is that I see no evidence for that realm. You show me evidence, real compelling evidence, not just unsubstantiated claims made repeatedly in a variety of ways, and I'll consider it. Anyway, defining terms. What does Gallups say that an atheist is? Well, quote, the broadest perception of atheism among atheists is, stated most correctly, a lack of belief in any gods. No specific claims or denials are made within this description. The atheist is simply one who does not happen to be a theist. He makes no declaration as to why he does not believe, nor does he state how he arrived at this monumental and perhaps eternal decision. Now, this is technically correct. You can be an atheist and you don't have to explain why you're an atheist or how you're an atheist. You can simply just be an atheist. That's perfectly legitimate. But when he describes it this way, it makes it sound as though atheism in practice among most atheists is just dogmatic. But I don't know many atheists who would describe their position this way. It's true that lack of belief in gods is a very common way of defining atheism, but most atheists I've encountered, including myself, are quite willing and able to explain why they don't believe and how they arrived at their conclusion. And for most of us, we arrived at that conclusion that gods don't exist the same way we, and Gallups presumably, arrived at the conclusion that leprechauns don't exist, because we see no compelling evidence. We know of no compelling arguments. So we don't accept the proposition. It's neither as dogmatic nor as evasively presented as Gallups states it. Gallups gets a bit more specific in defining atheism, differentiating a weak atheist, which is one who simply does not believe in gods, from a strong atheist, which is one who denies the existence of gods. Gallups calls weak atheism an insincere position that many atheists have adopted because they believe it to be invulnerable to criticism. Gallups says that strong atheism can be philosophically refuted with ease, which he promises that he will demonstrate shortly, so watch for that. Which is why even those who describe themselves as strong atheists will retreat to the weak atheist position on occasion. And he says, quote, "To further complicate the matter, a number of atheists make the strong atheist claim concerning certain specific gods, but not others. Thus, a person may lack belief in one god, but specifically deny the existence of another particular god altogether." Well, this only makes sense. Generally speaking, the more specifically defined the god, the more confidently one can take the strong atheist position. At least this has been my experience. The God of the Bible, for example, as described by Gallups and many other Christians of his type, is not this remote, unknowable deity, but a person with some definable characteristics who is supposed to have done some very specific things that can, at least in principle, be falsified. Weak atheism might be the most reasonable position with regard to a deistic God who's just sort of up there in the air somewhere and never interferes or participates in human affairs. But for the Christian God, who's always getting his hands dirty in this world, supposedly, or the gods of the ancient Greco-Roman pantheon, to offer another example, denial, rather than mere withholding of belief, is more reasonable to many of us for those, because those concepts of gods are built of more specific claims, which can be refuted, which allows us to conclude with more certainty that they don't exist. Gallups acknowledges that no simple definition of atheism is likely to satisfy all atheists, but that at the very least, an atheist is someone who declares that he has no belief in God. But why would someone not believe in God? Well, Gallups can think of two reasons. Either they don't want to believe in a God, or they have made up their mind that there is no God. Quote, "This is the strong atheist position, which insists there is no evidence for a God, nor a logical argument for a God's existence. Therefore, there cannot be a God. The reasonable conclusion one could draw for why someone would arrive at this definitive declaration is that the atheist has studied the issue thoroughly and has concluded without a doubt that there is no God in existence anywhere." Again, he can't resist distorting the position that he is meaning to describe. A strong atheist is typically described as one who asserts that no gods exist. But even this position is usually arrived at based on the available evidence. Sure, there are some strong atheists who say that the existence of any gods is a metaphysical or philosophical impossibility, but most of us base our atheism on the evidence, or lack thereof, for any gods. The fact that we find no evidence and no compelling arguments for a God's existence doesn't necessarily mean we believe that there cannot, in principle, be a God. It means we believe there isn't one. Gallups turns to the common claim among atheists that atheism is the natural position of humans, that we are born atheists, and that we then become religious by outside influence and indoctrination. And since there are far, far more people who identify as religious than as atheists, Gallups concludes that if this is true, far more atheists have become followers of religions than followers of religions have become atheists. Now, I want to take a moment here to acknowledge a point of very slight agreement between Gallups and myself. He's right. The notion that atheism is a natural state and that we are all born atheists is a very common one in the atheist community, and I'm not terribly comfortable with that notion, at least not as I see it being presented and how I see it being used among the community. Now, I'm not saying that people are born theists. That's obviously not true. It's true that we are not born, or that we are all born not believing in God. Gallups uses the prevalence of religious belief throughout the world to argue that religious belief is more natural than atheism, but just because people have an innate tendency to believe in gods, and I think that they do, that doesn't mean babies are born believing in gods, or that those beliefs are true, or even more plausible than they might otherwise be. It just means that our brains have certain tendencies. Being born with a tendency toward a sort of belief, a given kind of belief, is not the same thing as being born with that belief already in your mind. All the same, I think we should draw a distinction between the non-belief of a baby and the non-belief of an adult self-identifying atheist. When some of us say things like babies are atheists, we're making it sound like babies are atheists in the same sense that we are as grown-ups. But that can't possibly be true. Babies don't believe in gods because they have no comprehension of any of the factors involved. Adult, self-identifying atheists don't believe in gods because we have consciously come to that conclusion after some sort of a thought process. I'll agree that non-belief in gods is a natural state, but it's not the same as the sort of atheism we think about and talk about and identify ourselves with as adults who have considered these questions. Anyway, Gallups reiterates the statistics which tell us that most people say that they have some sort of belief in a God, even if they don't identify with a particular religion, while only a small minority identify specifically as atheists. And then he explores what he calls the philosophical ramifications of the beliefs of those who profess to not believe in a God because they have concluded that gods don't exist. Gallups compares the statement, "I do not believe in a god or gods because I have concluded that there is none," to the statement, "I do not believe that there are any four-headed frogs on the island of Oahu because I have definitively concluded that my belief is correct." A statement of non-belief in four-headed frogs on Oahu would be reasonable, Gallups says, since four-headed frogs have never been observed on Oahu or anywhere else. Quote, "However, what if abundant stories and testimonies proclaimed that a four-headed frog from Oahu in actuality had been seen? What if books had been written, absent photos, about a four-headed frog that lives somewhere in the forests and mountains of Oahu? Still, the belief that no such frog exists could be set forth with reason, since no one has one in possession for immediate observation. However, one would have to admit that the wisest and most intelligent thing to say in this case, and in light of the anecdotal evidence for the frog's possible existence, would be something like this. I think it is silly to believe in a four-headed frog. I do not believe in the existence of such a creature. However, I do leave open the possibility that such a creature could exist." And in fact, this is exactly what most atheists do say. Sure, there are a few of us who don't leave open the possibility that gods could exist, but this seems to be a small minority of the atheist group. We don't leave the possibility open because of the anecdotal evidence, necessarily, but because we acknowledge that to claim total certainty about anything is foolish, and we recognize that if our conclusion is truly based on evidence and arguments, then it should always be open to revision should better evidence and arguments ever present themselves. And it should be noted that none of the prominent atheists who have come to represent new atheism in the popular imagination and who Gallups has referenced in this book, Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, etc., describe their atheism as Gallups claims virtually all atheists do, as a position of total certainty in the non-existence of gods. Gallups claims to have engaged in abundant debates with atheists, yet he also claims that most atheists refuse to admit to there being even a possibility for God's existence. Those who do admit to this possibility, Gallups labels honest atheists, but he says most atheists are not honest atheists. Well, I have met some pretty dishonest atheists, but very few of them have been dishonest in the way that Carl Gallups is accusing them of being. So either Gallups and I have somehow encountered entirely different portions of the atheist community, or he is not being an honest apologist. Which would not be surprising, since in my experience, those are about as common as four-headed frogs. Next, Gallups ponders the mind of an atheist. And this pondering comes in the form of an endless series of rhetorical questions. What does an atheist think when he is overwhelmed by the vastness of the universe? What does he think when he contemplates the intricacy and delicacy of life on earth? To whom does he give thanks when he is overcome with wonderment and gratitude for his existence? And, quote, what happens if the atheist becomes an activist and protests against everything Christian, everything biblical? If the God against whom he so vigorously protests does not exist in his little fish pond of possibilities, and if he is certain of it, then why, may I ask, does he protest with such ferociousness against him? Is such illogical protestation not just one definition of insanity? Well, I would argue that when most atheists protest against something Christian, they aren't protesting against a God they deem imaginary, but against the political or social movements driven by the followers of that God in that God's name. The old prayer, Lord, protect us from your followers. And when atheists do specifically criticize or challenge or protest the God of Christianity, it's usually because that God, who is cruel and destructive by most standards of morality and decency, is being promoted as not only real, but as virtuous and loving and a standard of morality. You don't have to believe that a character in a book is real to observe that character is a poor role model. You may have noticed, despite the chapter title, that Gallups has not referred to agnosticism yet. Well, that's because he saved it for last, specifically for the last page of the chapter. Quote, the agnostic will often say he would believe in God if one could, without a doubt, prove his existence. He says this with a certain degree of smugness, believing the Christian cannot possibly prove the existence of God. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the logical, historical, scientific, and verified evidence for God's existence is irrefutable. The proof is before our eyes every single day. The evidence has existed for thousands of years. Would you like to know what the proof is? Yes? I certainly would. I must be one of those mythical, honest atheists that Gallups was talking about. Cool. Chapter 12, Proving the Existence of God, the Setup. Just in case the closing declaration of chapter 11, that the evidence for God's existence is irrefutable, wasn't a sufficient display of delusional overconfidence, Gallups begins chapter 12 with this, quote, the agnostic's request for proof is granted with ease, and they will not be able to logically dispute it. Furthermore, they will be forever accountable to God for what they now understand. Warning! If you are a professing unbeliever, you may wish to read no further. Now, obviously, Gallups is displaying an absurd amount of swagger here because he's not writing this book with any intention of winning anyone over who isn't already on his side. He said up front that this book is for believers, not to persuade non-believers. What he's doing is the equivalent of boasting to a bar full of his friends about the one-sided ass-kicking he's going to hand out to someone who isn't in the bar at the moment. But that cornball warning in all caps displays another sort of arrogance. Gallups explains that the warning is given seriously because once any non-believers are exposed to the irrefutable evidence of God that he is about to present, they will then be fully accountable to that God. So is Gallups actually assuming that any non-believers who happen to be reading this book will have never heard any of the evidence he's about to present? Like, there's some avowed atheist who is reading this book who's thinking to himself, oh wait, I've never heard a Christian try to defend his beliefs before. I better heed this warning lest I find myself accountable for my sin in the light of the undeniable proof of God. Or maybe Gallups actually is about to surprise us. Maybe he isn't going to just rehash the same old case for Christianity that we've heard over and over and over. The authority of the Bible, the miracle of the resurrection, the self-evident, intelligent design of the natural world, etc., etc., etc. Maybe he genuinely has some new, exciting evidence for the existence of his God. Evidence no one else has ever seen before. Evidence which he has chosen to reveal in the middle chapters of a book written for the benefit of people who believe in God already. Evidence which I have heard nothing about, despite the book containing it being published 3 years ago. Maybe. I don't know. Let's see. Quote, before we reveal the concrete proof for God's existence, we must first discuss the platform from which we will launch our revelation. At the core of biblical Christianity is the Bible itself. The Bible is like no other book in the world. To this day, it is the best-selling book on the planet and the best-selling book in the history of humanity. No other book comes close. So, rehashing the same old case it is then. Excellent. Here we go. The Old Testament, it seems, is filled with prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus and Jesus alone. The New Testament was written within the lifetimes of those who would have witnessed the life of Jesus themselves, or not too long after that. The Bible is composed of 66 books written by over 40 authors, writing at different times to different audiences about different things, and yet they all share a unified message with no errors or contradictions, and no archaeological discovery has ever proven any of its claims false. Jesus' miracles weren't protested as false during his life, so they must have actually happened. The crucifixion of Jesus is also beyond historical dispute, and while some might deny the resurrection, it's a fact that Jesus' body went somewhere and it's never been found, and the resurrection is better than any of the other alternative explanations, so that must have happened too. But don't get it twisted, as the kids and John Cena say. Quote, the preceding facts about the Bible have not been presented here as the proof for God's existence. God did not say that any of the facts that were earlier stated were the ultimate proof for his existence. The reason I spent a good deal of time examining the reliability of the Bible is because the Bible will be the launching pad for God's proof of his existence. Once we've launched, you will discover that irrefutable proof also exists outside of biblical sources. However, only the Bible has first recorded the proof, long before it happened. Gallup says that God says in the Bible that he has undeniably proven his existence. And if God, who is all-knowing and all-powerful, says that he has undeniably proven his existence, then Christians should be saying the same thing. So Gallups is telling us that God has undeniably proven his existence because that's what God says in the Bible. So it must be true. And that's why Christians should accept it, because God said it in the inspired, infallible Word of God. And we know that God said it because he said it in the Bible. And we know that the Bible is true because the Bible, you've heard this all before. Anyway, are you ready for the proof? Okay, here it comes. Quote, so what is God's own proof of his existence? What was it that he chose to hold out to his creation as evidence of his reality? The answer might surprise you. It is as plain as the nose on your face. It is before us every day, yet the majority of the world misses it. In the next chapter, you will see it clearly. And we will examine that chapter in the next video. It's a cliffhanger. I got you. I got you hooked. I dropped a hook right at the end of the video. Now you have to come back for the next episode. And actually, you know what? I haven't read ahead, so I don't know what the proof is going to be. I can't wait to find out what the evidence is. Can you? I am actually legitimately curious. I'm confident that Gallup's grossly overhyped, slam dunk, irrefutable evidence for God will underwhelm and disappoint me, but I'm interested to see how specifically it will underwhelm and disappoint me. As for chapter 12, what struck me most about it is how quickly Gallups rushed through all that stuff about the authority and the reliability of the Bible. I mean, he describes it himself in that quote I read you as saying, I took so much time describing the Bible, but he really didn't take that much time at all. He made it sound like the Cliff Notes version of what is typically the case for the Bible that is presented by apologists. The different authors, the supposedly unified message, the messianic prophecies, the life of Jesus, the resurrection. It's all there. It just goes by in a blur, one unsubstantiated assertion rushing by after another, with no time spent elaborating on any of them. And I'm not complaining. It's a tired and long since refuted case that I've heard over and over and over again already. But given Gallup's demonstrated affinity for elaborating on his premise in detail repeatedly, it's odd to see him blow through such, for his audience, crowd-pleasing material. Maybe he just ran out of room. The word count maybe got a little high on the manuscript, and the publisher told him that he had to cut some stuff out. And so he faced the choice of either truncating the evidence for the Bible being God's perfect and inerrant word and ultimate revelation to humanity, or shortening the endless parade of analogies used to illustrate the relatively simple concept of humans and God existing in separate dimensions. And he made his choice because as much as he loves the Bible, he really loves that fish pond story, and the anthill story, and the microbes one. I mean, sure, we could have gotten the point without all three of them, but we wouldn't have gotten the point as many times in a row, would we have? No, I think not. Anyway, that's it for this video, everybody. That's it for chapters 10, 11, and 12. In the next video in this series, I will be back to resolve this cliffhanger that I'm sure has you just digging your nails into your desks and sitting on the edge of your seat. You can't wait to hear what the irrefutable evidence, as obvious as the nose on your face, is for God. Well, we're going to find out in chapter 13, which is titled Proving the Existence of God, the Delivery. And I will also be covering chapter 14 in the next video, which is that your final answer? Ooh, timely references, timely pop culture references, Carl. Very good. Anyway, that's it, everybody. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate that this is of some interest and use to you. Please leave a comment telling me what you think. Agree, disagree, whatever you want to say. I'll be happy to read any comments you guys leave. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.